you can see at the top of the agenda, there are recording and slides from our first meeting last Thursday. Today's the meeting that we're having. Today's the 16th, and we planned another touch base meeting for the full subgroup on April 23rd. We've had a lot of writing sprints where either we are co-writing or engaging in discussion that have been really good. And our next one is on Friday, where we will be working on the data collections document, the metadata standards and data quality document, and the storage document. And then on Monday, the other 3 documents, there's a 2-hour writing block. Arena's leading those. So she has a 2-hour writing block. So please join those if you are interested in those particular topics. I'm going to move on now, I think, to the agenda. So obviously, most of you know by now that we do have an email, which we were using to communicate to the broad group about when our meetings were and what our goals were, and to share the locations of our writing documents. There's also a Slack channel for the RDA COVID group overall, a Slack workspace. And we have a channel that we can use for communication and discussion as well. We don't have a lot of people on it. We will be able to invite you to the Slack channel. So if you've not been added and want to be added, please do let one of us know. You can email us. Hopefully everyone has our individual emails. And I wanted to just briefly open it up to the group to talk about sort of the utility of the Slack channel and how we might use it to be more productive with how we've been engaging with each other and communicating. So I don't know, are people raising hands? Is that right, Arena? I don't know, this is GoToMeeting. This is different than I was getting used to Zoom.
Yeah, we're not many, so maybe we can just talk.
Just talk, good, sounds good. Barge right in, any ideas about the Slack channel, opposition to it? Is it just one more duplicative thing? Is it welcome? Looking down, I don't see any.
I guess there are no strong opinions. So maybe if there is no desire to use Slack, maybe we'll just use emails and have writing sprints, because we have quite a lot of them. So we see each other anyway every two or 3 days.
Yeah. Thanks, Serena. So we will do that. The next on the agenda that we wanted to talk about were the first of the documents that we've been working on. Arena and I took a crack at drafting the scope for our group and what is included in the domain of the social sciences of interest to COVID-19. And that document covers both the disciplines and the topic areas. It overlaps most closely with the members of this subgroup in terms of interests and disciplines. And so for the areas that we didn't have anybody interested in, they don't yet appear in the scope document, but it does then give people a sense of the rest of the recommendations we're making about the data type. So if a data type is not there, it's because perhaps it was not in scope for what we were writing. And I wanted to open up for discussion if anyone's had a chance to take a look at that scoping document. It's intentionally brief because ultimately I think the heart of what we want to do is in the recommendations, and we want to have space to do that. And I can't click on this for some reason. Oh, yes, I can.
I don't know, maybe even if we don't have an expert in our group, but we identify this as an important topic, maybe we should still keep it.
Yeah, I think the one that nobody endorsed was, well, one was health disparities, and I did put that in there because I felt like it wasn't something we could really leave out, at least in the US context. Another of the research areas that I did leave out was family, but that's kind of cross-cutting against across many of these areas. Go ahead, Claudia.
It's just that I cannot understand Amy. Her voice keeps getting cut. I don't know if this is happening to everybody else. I can't understand.
Yeah, maybe I can repeat.
I'm afraid the problem is on your side, Claudia.
Oh, okay. So it's my side.
I think
okay,
so. I can hear everything loud and clear.
Oh, okay. I can hear everybody loud and clear except for Amy. So that's fine. Okay.
So maybe I can quickly repeat what Amy said, that she studied scope draft text, and she copied research areas that we discussed last Thursday, all except health disparities and family, because we didn't have anyone who signed up for any of these topics, and because family seemed like a cross-cutting issue anyway, and health disparity is something that maybe social sciences are not really addressing directly. So that was a discussion, should we still add health disparities and family, or leave it out?
I'm a computer scientist, so I have no saying in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did include health disparities, I should say, even though just because it is super important in the US context. And that is something that inevitably social scientists will be collecting data about.
And I'll jump in and say something. The first thing I'll say is I'm Katie McNeil, and I wasn't at the call last week. So nice to meet you all for who I haven't met before. And I think my comment, which is maybe a bit similar to yours, Claudia, is that there are probably some people in the group who are researchers and have very in-depth research expertise in particular areas, and then others of us who have a broad awareness across social science data fields. So depending on our criteria, if we feel like we have reasonable knowledge, even if we don't have deep expertise, I would still err on the side of being generous with our scope myself.
Yeah, we were clear too. It was about interest or experience. And so I think there's a lot of, just having somebody who's interested enough to go out and look at some of the resources and be sure that we're capturing them in the resource list overall, and thinking about them as we're producing our recommendations seem to make sense. So yes, we don't assume everyone is a researcher by any means. We don't want that.
This is Ingrid. I also think that we should keep health disparities or health inequality on the list, because I imagine that it's not only a US thing, it's also, the whole of the global South, where people are in quite a different position than us in the West.
And there are a number of social science data sets that are, largely surveys, but they will have some, biomarker measurements in them. People have a survey and then they get a blood test taken. So I think that increasingly you see a lot of that in the social sciences. So you'll get measurements like that too.
And what about family? Because I don't know, to me, family maybe is slightly different category from all others that we already have. Because family is part of quality of life and well-being, I guess. Because we had it as
it's more like a kind of cross-cutting theme again, right? Yeah.
I'm highlighting, does everyone see the disciplines? Are we okay with this listing of disciplines? Economics, sociology, political science, demography, psychology. We did have the question when we met with the broader group about the humanities, and that was out of scope for us, and we don't have people representing that. I think that would be perhaps too big, especially for this time period.
We also have some people who are experts in education, but I don't know whether that's a research area.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can add researchers in, I don't know, education technologies, or what would be a right way to call it?
Oops.
And then while you're adding that, I have a comment, but I first see that Brian Pickering sent in a note because his mic isn't working. His thoughts on family and health disparities are very significant. Families being isolated together causes anxieties and tensions, and there are reports already that domestic violence is increasing, which is absolutely a good point. I think that it might be worth, even though you could see that under the umbrella of quality of life and well-being, it might be worth calling it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, victimization. Certainly,
Yeah, I think it's best to say among others, because we cannot do it exhaustively.
Yeah.
Since
And
religious beliefs, I don't know where that fits in, but evangelical groups are making a big difference in many regions.
Yep.
and
Great.
the one thing Sarah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kate.
This is Katie again. The one thing I'll just say is that I'm happy with it being within the sort of umbrella of economics. I'm thinking about business, and I have to work in a business library, so that's something that I, among other things, can contribute. But I don't feel like we need to call that out per se. If we feel like economics could include the impact on businesses, I think it makes sense to just keep it in there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great that you have that expertise.
Yes, and like, everybody's working remotely, and that changes how people in workplace are working, for profit or nonprofit. So, so actually, and I might even add that as like, if people think it would be interest to sort of to the sub bullet list of the idea that within organizations, there's this dramatic change of how work is happening. So anyway, we don't have to decide that now, but it's just an idea.
Yeah, sure. And like organizational sociology, isn't really represented in the list, sort of.
Yeah.
Or psychology.
It's like the workplace equivalent of online learning in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's something we could also add to unemployment and economic impact.
Would that work? I put work, unemployment, and economic impact just to sort of start going down that road, but we can revisit these. Yeah, great suggestion. Thank you, everyone.
Maybe we should add back family, victimization,
yes,
or something like that, that it's broader than just family.
Yeah. I'm going to put it there. We can probably say it more elegantly or interestingly. Okay.
May I ask, when we put family, how are we going to measure the impact of family? Because there are families that are happy and families that are unhappy, and this has big impact on the whole situation.
We could say family and intergenerational relationships. I mean, that's certainly very common.
And maybe I can mention
all of those things seem to be different right now. Yeah, go ahead, Ingrid.
No, that was Irina. And one more reason why we went back to the scope is because we have in our group a colleague from Operas, which is an European infrastructure for social science and humanities monographs. And I linked in the minutes a new project that they are starting, Triple, and they want to create an open library to support inclusive, innovative, and reflective societies in times of crisis, which they called Beyond COVID-19. And they also started as a terror library, which they called Beyond COVID-19. It's open edition project in France. So they started with their typology and categorization, which they had in France. And then they added our research areas topics, and they want to align them at some point. And there might be similar projects like this. So if we could really be inclusive with a list of topics, I think they will be picked up by other projects. So that was one of the reasons why we stressed again these research areas and scope to make sure that we're not missing anything.
Irina, do we know if they are looking for anything else from us at this point?
No, just they said that they when we have our scope listed, they'll refine what they have in their library. So they'll just use the scope from our document.
I cannot find where to raise my hand. I'm sorry. I have two questions. The first question is whether or not to mention that it's also social, political, economic, and cultural impact in the first sentence, because that does not hurt. And the second question is, where do we put the fact that without social science research, the other kinds of research will not go much further? Or not as further as they should.
Well, maybe
it sort of gets at that a little bit, but yeah, we can definitely make that clearer and stronger.
And we can also refer to previous pandemics, because that was a problem with MERS and SARS, that they really looked into effects caused by isolation of people, but they didn't look at effects it caused on well-being, social life, etc. So maybe we can add a sentence like this to avoid mistakes from previous pandemics. We are stressing that human condition is really important and should be.
Yeah, doctors in Brazil, those that are conducting research on SARS, are saying that they cannot go along without working together with social scientists, and that they need more social scientists to work with them in their research and finding new drugs or whatever. So it's just not microscopes, it's also about social conditions. And which is, so even though this is about social sciences, bridges, I'm not Cuomo, but bridges could be built in the document.
Mm-hmm.
And if we added culture, should we add cultural anthropology, or would it be humanities?
I think I haven't heard that as something that we are giving thought to as we're making our recommendations. So maybe we could leave that open-ended for now. And if we have someone who can do that, and make contributions, we can always expand it. I did have the same thought though. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Well, take a look at this and feel free to make comments or edits to strengthen it further. If we move on, in the interest of time, to updates from the writing sprints, I think I have the first three, but go ahead and click through. The first is the data collections document. I actually think it's in quite good shape. The areas that we were looking for recommendations for this one was talking about the key data types in the social sciences. And we've covered survey, I guess vital statistics data, political speech data, policy responses data, citizen responses, social media data. I saw somebody was going in this morning making some changes. We have more on data from search engines, sensor and tracking data, transactional data from consumer purchasing. We don't say a lot, but image data certainly are in use across the social sciences, app data from apps, and then we only have sort of everything mostly lumped together, in-depth interviews and focus groups and textual data. There is in the next section a place to talk about formats, so I don't think this is about that, but rather the big data types. We might think about ways that we could organize these to present them in a more coherent way. But this is sort of the status of this document, and as I mentioned, we'll be tackling this document and refining it tomorrow. And at the end of the agenda today, we had a discussion about how we really need to, over the course of the next 6 days, take these documents to draft, a sort of a complete draft. And so we'll talk about the process of taking this very raw information and turning it into a more refined set of guidelines. I'll just move along to the next document so we can get through all of them. The next document, it was looking for recommendations on documentation standards and data quality. We have a list of the key metadata standards, and I think we'll need to assign somebody or look for volunteers, I should say, to enter these into the database. There's also a listing of the controlled vocabularies. They're sort of heavily weighed on what I could find or what we could find across Europe and some in the US. But then there was a very good discussion led by Laura about the very, very vast amount of disciplinary specific vocabularies and ontologies that we could provide links to. And so while we might provide a couple of examples in our document, that might be a better place to add the ones that we think can be most helpful again to the database. The files format, I mentioned, it's not very exhaustive on it. I'm not sure the value of this, how much more detailed we need to be. We had a really great discussion on disciplinary norms, which are just not disciplinary norms, but they also differ from country to country in terms of how data sharing is different in different places. And so we've represented, I think, that discussion. And then we have expectations about data quality that we've talked about. I think is there anything else? I think that gets us to the end of this document. So please, if it's an interest area, sign on to the writing team, join us for the writing group for this document. And then the third one we've not tackled yet. It feels like it might be a briefer recommendation set to us, especially because preservation is covered in another area. But we will be writing on storage and backup. If you have some ideas, please, by all means, jot them down, and we'll be talking about this document a little bit more fully tomorrow morning. Are there questions about the first three before I turn it over to Irina?
This is Claudia again. From everything that you've presented, don't you think storage and backup could be just left to one sentence. So store and backup as your institution sees fit or something like that, because it's been covered in preservation, it's been covered in quality, it's been covered in all kinds of things. And this way you'd kind of eliminate this part. I don't know.
Another option could be to link to already existing advice. For example, SESDA training
Yes.
manual has a good section on data storage. So maybe we just write a sentence and then say, for more information, check out that section in SESDA guide.
Yeah, I just added to the chat a kind of similar comment about referring where appropriate to requirements of the Core Trust Seal standard for trustworthy digital repositories, for example, concerning storage and backup. So that might be another resource that if people feel that what is written there is useful, can be referred to.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ingrid. And we have Wim from Core Trust Seal team who is contributing that to data sharing and preservation part.
We did have a little discussion about wanting to make the point that I think some data have to stay within national boundaries and some data can be backed up and stored across boundaries. And so I think like pointing out in the social science context that we do have these different conditions that arise might be one of the things we wanted to add.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, maybe we should move on now. Do you want me to keep driving, Irina?
Yeah, maybe keep sharing and I'll talk.
Okay.
Thanks. So we had our writing sprint yesterday. Thanks a lot for joining it. And we developed a new structure for legal and ethical requirement documents. Yeah, and it's at the bottom of the page. So we decided that we'll start with types of personal data because they are somehow covered already in this data collection part, but we'll specifically stress sensitive personal data that will be collected for COVID. And then we decided to use 5 safes approach to address some of the issues. And then we also said that we'll focus on ethical requirements with a special emphasis on vulnerable population stigma tracking indigenous populations. And we also had an interesting discussion yesterday about individual versus community interests. And Pam, who couldn't join today, mentioned a statement that African Academy of Sciences released. And it's mentioned as a use case in this document somewhere further down. And it's about slightly modified approach to informed consents. Trying to find it now. Yeah, it's on page 8, at the top of page 8 of this document. And also there was a change of law in Japan to allow more relaxed collection of personal data and reuse in times of COVID. And we all know South Korean approach where they basically took a lot of personal data and made them available. So we'll mention cases like this. And the goal of this section would be to provide recommendations on finding the right balance between as open as possible, as closed as necessary, maintaining trust, society trust in researchers' work. And what we also have already a number of recommendations that could be recommendations for researchers, but also recommendations for policymakers. So I guess out of this sentence, we could draw some like higher level recommendations for policymakers as well, not only for social scientists. And then we also had an interesting discussion about data from individuals and data collected from collected by companies. Like there was recently this announcement from Apple about making available data about people's movement. And of course, it's not a focus of our working group per se, but maybe somewhere we can mention that when companies are releasing this big data, they should also follow certain rules so that social scientists could actually use and reuse their data. So that's a summary of legal and ethical document, and we'll continue on Monday between 10 and 12 UTC. And we'll of course do some more writing. And maybe Amy, you could open the next document about data sharing and preservation, which is a lot more straightforward document, because here we basically encourage data sharing again as open as possible, as closed as necessary. We decided to split this document into two parts. So one will be about data sharing, one will be about long-term preservation. And we also said that we'll use FAIR framework to create sections in this document. And then yesterday we had a discussion, what do we actually want to recommend? Do we want to recommend, like what would be hierarchy of repositories that we're recommending? Are we recommending those repositories that are certified with Quatra seal as the first choice, or do we recommend disciplinary repositories as first choice? What do we do with institutional repositories that collect data? So we had all this discussion, and then we agreed that we'll say that the FAIR repository is better, but if for some reasons researchers can't use disciplinary repositories, then they could still use their institutional ones to make data available, maybe not in the best way, but at least somehow available. So that was most of the discussion that we had.
Excuse me, this is Claudia. I'm sorry, maybe I got it wrong from this repository discussion yesterday, but there was someone who said that it may be better not to think of disciplinary, but of these repositories that would facilitate connection across disciplines. It depends on what you call disciplinary.
Yeah, you can also add that.
The word used was to avoid silo-like repositories. But maybe I'm mixing up with another discussion I had with another.
Hello. Yeah, no, that was a point I raised around, I think, in particular, if we were thinking about institutional repositories. So I think the idea of when we say a FAIR repository, but a hierarchy of fairer repositories where the data is more findable and interoperable is preferred, rather than kind of saying that any repository is as good as any other kind of thing. I think that's what we thought about in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess our message would be like avoid silos, avoid putting your data somewhere where it won't be really discoverable.
Yep.
And we also have to write a lot in this document, but it's I guess it's a little bit easier than legal and ethical requirements, because we're basically recommending existing good practices. And then we also briefly touched upon the last document, which was about data management responsibilities and resources. And we first were slightly confused what exactly should go there. And then we thought, because we don't talk about data management plans in any other document, so let's talk about data management plans here. And let's also put here everything that we couldn't put in any other sections of this recommendations. So that's like a placeholder for anything else that we'd like to mention, and for some reason couldn't, because there was no space for that. Because data management responsibilities would vary a lot, culture to culture. There will be some institutional requirements, so there is not much we can put as recommendation, but we can point to some resources. So I hope that captures our yesterday's discussion, and please chip in and add what I missed. And also, if you feel like something else is missing from all these documents, I guess that's the right moment to raise it and see how we can discuss it. And like Amy said, we have one writing sprint tomorrow about the first 3 documents, same time as today, same link as last time when we had writing sprint about 3 documents, and then another one on Monday, 10 to 12 UTC, same link as yesterday for the last 3 sections. And we're aiming at having a text ready by Tuesday, 21st, like we discussed.
Gosh, not 6 days. I was trying to make it 6. That's not 6.
Yeah. So maybe that's a part where we can talk.
That's what we should talk about.
Yeah, how we compile these documents into one. I think in terms of styling, we are sort of okay, because Amy and I are keeping an eye on all these documents to see that we're using more or less same style. But it would still be an exercise to make one document out of these 6.
Is there such, I'm just thinking aloud. Obviously, we've been talking about organizing it as a core document and lots of, or maybe one big annex, hyperlinked annex with pointers to resources and things like that. Would there be a top level meta document? So a meta document that would point to because this is getting bigger and bigger. So what are your and Amy's thoughts on the overall organization, so that afterwards it can be linked to the 4 other groups?
And Ingrid's thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I consider Ingrid as being at the top level. So how do the 2 of you will help Ingrid?
Well, shall I step in here?
Yeah, I was thinking it might be helpful to hear for the person who has the vantage point on sort of all the work of the other groups.
Yeah, so at the moment, our thought, and in this context means the thoughts of the co-chairs of the working group, is that for this first sprint, with the deadline that we have of the 24th of April, we will probably not strive to have one overarching document ready for the 5 groups. The idea is to have documents for the 5 groups only. We, of course, will try to watch closely that we have comparable documents, so that we don't have a whole fruit baskets of completely different fruit at the end of the first sprint. And the suggested structure of the recommendation documents is, of course, an instrument to lead that a little bit. What I do see happening in the different groups is that people take different approaches, use different methodologies. I personally think that this is a very good example, this group, and a very active group. And I like the way that you work so intensely with those writing sprints. The consequence of that, of course, is that you also, because you have this strong engagement from people, that you also produce a lot of text. And I have not seen that happening in some of the other groups. So I'm also curious what we will have at the end for this group. And overall, my ideal picture would be that from this amount of text that you have, you will be able to lift out, let's say, well, meta recommendations is probably too big a word, but for each of these sections, you can extract, let's say, 3 or 4 very important recommendations already on the basis of what you have there. And that can be a kind of overarching document that is presented as the result of on the 24th, and that there are links to the underlying information, which is probably much more, but it would be nice to have something really concise that people are not discouraged to go through from the beginning to the end. And people who are really interested can dive in deeper. And we also need to think about the fact that we thought that well, maybe it's not, I see we're discussing an executive summary, and maybe the important thing, I think, is that it's also written down as recommendations. And we, of course, have the plan and also the ask from the Commission to serve 2 audiences in a way, the researchers on the one hand, but the policymakers on the other hand. So there also, you can imagine that there is a difference in granularity of the recommendations. So it could, but I'm just talking from the top of my head. Maybe the overarching recommendations would be the ones that are also digestible for policymakers, and what is below is much more geared towards the researchers who do the actual work. But of course, it's the job of the co-chairs to make sure, while watching what's happening in our subgroups, that we try to steer and give some advice to make sure that at the end of the day of the first sprint, we have material that is similar for the 5 groups. I hope that helps a little bit.
Oh, Ingrid, it's just that after this group, I mean, I'm participating in another group and I'm very confused there. And here I'm very glad for the guidance Amy and Irina are giving. I'm speaking about Cuomo's address yesterday, in which he gave a very clear presentation of the next steps, presenting a matrix. So this is just a suggestion. You might, or we might, think about what would be the most important things along data's life cycle. I think a lot about life cycles, and that would be, say, the columns, and then the rows would indicate the subgroups, for instance, or something like that. I don't know. I'm just, if nobody saw Cuomo's address yesterday about what's going to be done, it's really a good idea of presenting priorities, guidelines, and things like that.
I like that suggestion, Claudia, but I do wonder if it's sort of, I think it's probably something to remind ourselves of after we get past this initial deadline, because I think we're, as Ingrid was saying, we want to produce something that's comparable to the other groups. And so the template that's been provided, I could see how we might take major types of data and then talk about the metadata standards for that and how to preserve it and what kind of repository homes are best for it. The matrix approach, like you were saying, perhaps, but I think that would take us too far from what we have to produce in this next short period.
Yeah, no, it's just that since this is a better organized group, I'm just throwing this idea here to think about the future is a good idea. Thank you. I'm sorry to have spoken for so long.
Apologies not needed. That was great. I think it's a good idea.
So maybe we can call for people who would like to help us with editing this one document where we will merge all 6 documents. So if you could indicate in the chat that you'd like to help with that, that would be great. And maybe what we can do as first iteration on the 21st to have scope list all recommendations, and then have all the sections after it where we'll talk about data collection, documentation, legal issues, storage and preservation in more details. Yeah, and thanks a lot for volunteering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think we need kind of a broad editing group to sew all the pieces together, but then I think just because some of the sections have gotten so long, I think we do need to use that more as the raw data that then informs the writing that gets written, that is the top recommendations, as Ingrid was mentioning. So if you have also strong interest in any one of these 6 and want to say, I want to take a pass at distilling this down to the essential recommendations, I think that would be great. I mean, it's hard because I think we also might want to make sure that we that person joins the writing sprints over Friday and Monday to be sure that we're clear sort of as a group what we want to make sure we keep and what we might be willing to lose in that first set of, narrower recommendation, not narrower, but high level recommendations. Because I think it would be, unfortunate if only, Arena and I were doing that. I think it should be probably distributed a bit across the group so that we have, people who are most relevant in an area doing some of that. I'm happy to take 1 or 2 of them. But if other people are interested in this part of the editing process before we turn it over to a editorial group to put it all together, probably at the end of Monday. Please let us know.
Thanks a lot, Brian, Casey, Louise, Claudia, and Laura for volunteering. And all of you are involved in subsection documents already. So maybe that's what we can discuss on Friday and Monday, allocating one of the documents to one of us and then making together this one overarching document. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, an executive summary. I like that. Kate sort of described it. It is sort of, writing an executive summary from this really good fodder that we've produced. Okay. Arena, anything else?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Any questions, suggestions, anything else we need to discuss today? Yeah, maybe I can briefly mention that I think that's what Claudia already started mentioning, that other working groups started with resources, and they suggested to use Zotero for creating a library of resources and describing them a little bit better. But in their case, resources, I guess, are more important because they already have like really COVID-related recommendations. And I think in our case, it's not the case. So Amy and I were sort of a bit reluctant to start digging into Zotero and creating another library with all the resources. So we thought we'll start with recommendations part of the document, and then we'll use Google Spreadsheet, which was initially suggested for suggesting resources. And then we'll see at the next step when we'll be asked to use Zotero only, then maybe we can start doing that. But for now, we were reassured that everything that is added via Google Spreadsheet would still be part of Zotero library because it will be automatically redirected. But if one of you are Zotero lovers and if you would like to take on this job, we'll give you all the rights to manage this collection because we have access to editing the Zotero library, but we felt like we're pressed for time and we would rather focus on recommendations and description of resources.
And by the Excel sheet or the sheets, you mean the Google form? Is that right, Arena?
Yeah.
We should be using the Google form link here in 4A to enter the. But I guess maybe from Ingrid clarification. So when I'm thinking about, so I feel like this document was a good example where we've identified things like the data documentation initiative. That should be a resource, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Social sciences ads. Is that right?
I think you should interpret the term resource as broadly as possible. So it's definitely not only data sets, it's tools, it's guidelines, it can be all kinds of stuff. And the idea, of course, would be that you. I'm sorry?
These two, like the thesaurus, the thesauri that we've added, like HACCET and LSAT and.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to need to make sure that we get those into the resource bank.
May I ask a clarifying question? I'm not sure if I lost the link somewhere of where we can view the Google Sheet. Maybe it's somewhere on the website. So obviously we don't then add a resource that's already in there.
It's at the top of this Google form.
I'm clicking on it.
Yeah, you see it. See responses at.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's a link where you can see
it. Okay, thank you.
I have nothing in here.
Yeah, I keep an eye on it. I think recommendations to our groups are the most common ones here, and I keep an eye that whatever is listed here is also reflected in our document. But there are not many yet.
Yes, I think most groups haven't gotten to this yet.
Or maybe they use Zotero, because at least two of them said that they would do.
Right, so our things will end up here unless we choose to use the Zotero. But I think this is simple and easy to just go ahead and use. But
yeah, I agree.
I'm sorry, you keep talking about Terra. I don't know what you're talking about.
Zotero reference management system.
Sorry, never heard of it. Glad that you mentioned it afterwards. That's okay. Don't worry.
We did have a window open when we were talking about that group that was interested. This one here, you can see it. This isn't for ours, but this was the group that was looking to be.
Yeah.
And I also put a link in the chat. So it's not ours, but it's just another example of COVID-19, the Terra library. And I guess there are many of them because it's a common. It's free and open source tool for reference management.
Great.
I'm wondering in terms of, sorry, just I don't know, tangentially, in terms of, we've got a lot of information that we're producing. If we're then doing an executive summary, is it that the information we produce would then form some sort of wiki so that the executive summary essentially would just say, more information, you can look on the wiki, and it would have information more in depth of all the other information that we've produced?
I think that maybe that is something we need to decide on the overarching level of the 5 groups, because I can subgroups, because I can imagine that other groups are struggling with the same issues. So that is something that I will take with me to the table on Monday night when we have a co-chairs meeting again, to hear what's happening in the other groups and how we make sure that we do all of this in the same way.
Yeah,
so
okay, great. Yeah, I just thought that might be a really good way for the audience to sort of get the information they need.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
And we have wiki functionality on our group page, so if we decide to use it, we can easily move everything there. Yeah, but then Claudia is resisting against wiki. Yeah, that maybe that's something that we will need to discuss on Thursday when we have our next call and when we have a better idea of recommendations.
Yesterday's big group workshop, I heard that so after the first stage, there will be further deliverable, like something like a decision tree. I was imagining that would be an opportunity to do the detailed things. So for example, if you are collecting qualitative data, then what are some of the recommendations about qualitative data management resources or consent form? I'm thinking at that point, but if the chair can let us know maybe the further steps, and that we'll be able to integrate that with the decision tree idea. I don't know whether you have already planned that.
Yeah, we only briefly discussed with Amy how are we going to make a decision tree. We'll probably need to have a number of decision trees, like you said, for qualitative data, for quantitative data, for sensitive data. I don't know for which else data. But yeah, that's the next exercise when we are done with recommendations.
Yeah, that's definitely a next step, but it will then also again be, I imagine, discussed at the overall working group level to make sure that when we, if and when we really go for designing a decision tree, we need to do it in the same way over all the groups, and choose a tool, etc., etc. So that will be thoroughly discussed before we start that exercise.
So we're almost at the top of our 1 hour. So we have 1 more minute in case we need to discuss anything else. Otherwise, see you on Friday or Monday at the sprints. And then on Thursday, we'll have our general call, and it would be same Zoom meeting link as the first time. And in the minutes, there is a link to that. Thanks a million. That's really helpful, and it's so great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yep. See you tomorrow, hopefully.